Summer, 1944. On the stifling Bocage fields of Normandy, where the echoes of artillery hadn't yet faded before machine guns roared again, a lone American mechanic stood quietly, holding a strange-looking sketch in his hands. He didn't carry a rifle, didn't give orders, and wore no stars on his collar, just a grease-stained uniform and a gaze that had never learned to back down. No one really knew what he was doing. While his comrades remained bogged down in the thick hedgerows of German defences, he quietly cut and welded steel beams, salvaged from enemy roadblocks, fastening them to the front of a Sherman tank like some prehistoric weapon. They watched him with doubtful eyes until that first Sherman, now bearing a pair of rhino horns, roared to life and tore through a Bocage wall like it was paper. From that moment on, the German supply line began to crumble, not under the weight of bombs or artillery, but because of a weapon no one had seen before. A weapon forged not in a factory, but by the hands of an unknown mechanic, and no one could have guessed that something so simple could shift the tide of an entire battlefield. In the summer of 1944, the battlefront in Normandy had come to a standstill. The Bocage terrain, with its dense hedgerows weaving like a labyrinth, had turned the French countryside into a natural fortress perfectly suited for German defense. Sherman tanks were repeatedly getting stuck, infantry units were suffering heavy losses, and even Allied air power struggled under the cover of thick foliage. As Operation Overlord began to stall, one American mechanic quietly picked up a few pieces of scrap steel, bent over a welding torch, and sparked an idea no one could have imagined. That quiet soldier was a 29-year-old sergeant from the US, the 2nd Armored Division. His name was Curtis G. Culin. Before putting on a uniform, Culin was just an ordinary young man from the town of Cranford, New Jersey. The son of a mechanic, he grew up surrounded by the sound of hammering and the smell of grease inside a workshop. As a boy, he was known for taking machines apart, just to see what made them tick. When war broke out, Culin volunteered for the local armoured unit, eventually becoming a tank operator, guiding 30-ton steel beasts across Europe. In Normandy, after D-Day, he and his unit entered their first wave of assaults, and like so many other tank crews, he witnessed the worst. Every Sherman that tried to push through the Bocage got hit mid-climb, wedged in place, and turned into target practice. The infantry behind them couldn't advance. Entire crews were wiped out inside their tanks, once, then twice, then again and again until Curtis saw the truth. The issue wasn't the power of the Sherman, but the way it was being used. As a mechanic, he could clearly see the technical flaw holding his entire division back, and that realization made it impossible for him to sit still. During a conversation among tank soldiers, half serious and half defeated, someone laughed and said, "Why don't we just weld a pair of massive saw blades to the front of the tank and ram through?" The comment came out amid sighs and weary glances, but in Curtis's mind, it hit something deep. To him, it wasn't a joke, it was a solution. He instantly envisioned a tank with steel blades mounted on the front, not climbing over the hedgerows, but ploughing through them like a field tiller. A simple device, strong enough to shear off roots right at the ground, allowing the tank to stay level without exposing its underbelly, while even using the fallen brush as makeshift camouflage. That evening, in a field tent, Curtis began sketching the first lines of what would become a war-changing invention. The idea had struck, but the road from concept to victory was still a long one. Curtis Culin began with a crude hand drawing on the back of an ammo box, refining it day by day based on what he saw on the battlefield. There was no design office, no engineers to help. Just instinct, a mechanic's experience, and the urgency of a soldier running out of time. When he was finally satisfied with the sketch, he brought it to his superiors, a decision far from easy. The entire regiment was grappling with casualties, morale was low, and everything weighed under the pressure of the coming offensive. A mechanic with a civilian background now asking permission to weld horns onto the front of a tank. To many, it was laughable. Some mid-ranking officers showed visible doubt. They had watched entire engineer corps fail to solve the Bocage problem. How could a single motor pool sergeant possibly turn the tide? But someone listened. A few commanders, weary but with nothing left to lose, realized that sometimes the craziest ideas are exactly what we need when everything else has failed. And they nodded. Permission granted. The first problem appeared immediately. Where would they find the steel? Culin needed metal tough enough to withstand direct impact with thick vegetation, long and thick enough to weld securely to the tank's frame without interfering with the engine or suspension system. He couldn't strip it from another Sherman, each one was a strategic asset, and shipping it from England would take too long. The answer had to be found right there, in Normandy. And then Culin looked up. Scattered across the beach where thousands of Allied soldiers had fallen on D-Day, still stood the German anti-tank obstacles planted to block the American advance. Massive I-beams driven into the sand, rusted and forgotten. To others, they were battlefield debris. To Curtis, they were the perfect resource. They were known as Czech hedgehogs, a famous anti-tank trap originally invented in Czechoslovakia and deployed by the Nazis across Europe. Made from heavy cast steel with sharp angles, each beam stretched between 1 and 2 meters, ideal for the blades Culin had in mind. The irony was rich. A weapon designed to stop the American advance would now be recycled to tear open German defenses from within, a cinematic reversal of fate. Curtis didn't waste a second. He gathered a small team of fellow soldiers, mainly engineers and mechanics. At night, they pried the hedgehogs from the sand using crowbars, handsaws, and air-powered cutters. By day, in a makeshift repair shack patched together from sheet metal, they welded the steel into twin-pointed spears, sharp at both ends like the horns of a charging rhinoceros. Each blade was bolted onto a crossbar, then fixed securely to the front chassis of a Sherman tank. That first test model was a mixture of nerves and blind faith. No engineers ran stress tests. No one calculated impact force. Everything was done with instinct and belief. A few days later, the first horned Sherman rumbled out of the shed. No one said a word, but every eye followed its movement. Its silhouette was so bizarre it looked like a prehistoric beast clawing its way out of the earth, rough, uneven, and awkward, yet radiating a kind of brute force that made hearts race. In the heavy atmosphere of a stalled battlefield, that Rhino Sherman was more than a machine. It was steel-clad hope. It was a declaration that Americans would not sit still in front of any obstacle. And now, all eyes turned to the same question. When would it be tested? When would it charge into the Bocage for real? And most importantly, would it break through or be just another forgotten invention in the chaos of war? That long-awaited moment finally came. A misty morning settled over the Normandy fields. In a small clearing boxed in by towering walls of hedgerows, the very terrain that had crippled so many armored units, the Rhino Sherman was rolled out for testing. Gathered around were soldiers, engineers, officers, and even high-ranking generals like Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. No one spoke. Only the soft growl of a diesel engine hummed under the breath of a cold wind rustling through the leaves. The tank slowly rolled into position. In front of it stood a dense hedgerow, taller than a man, its roots dug deep, its canopy so thick you couldn't see the ground on the other side. Countless Sherman tanks had already fallen to obstacles like this. So many crews never even saw the Germans before being torn apart in a hail of bullets. But today, something different was unfolding. The command rang out, firm and without hesitation. Advance! The Sherman growled to life. Its engine roared. Dust kicked up in a furious cloud. In an instant, the steel Rhino surged forward, like a 30-ton spear aimed directly at the wall of greenery as if it didn't exist. Boom! The 4 iron horns stabbed into the base of the hedgerow, tearing deep into the earth. Wood splintered, roots cracked, soil exploded upward. The entire hedgerow shuddered as if rocked by an explosion. Leaves, branches, and wet dirt showered the tank, forming a strange, crude camouflage over its hull. But the most incredible thing was this. The tank didn't stop. Not for a second. It didn't slow. It powered through as if the Bocage was nothing more than a curtain of grass. Within seconds, the Sherman had burst through the thickest hedgerow the Americans had faced, rolling confidently onto the other side, where German machine guns had once waited to fire directly into the exposed bellies of advancing tanks. Not this time. The Sherman's main gun turned. Boom! A German strongpoint was wiped out in a flash. Enemy soldiers, caught completely off guard, scattered in panic under a wave of fire. The onlookers stood frozen. Then suddenly, cheers erupted across the field, clapping, shouting, whistling. Soldiers who had been ground down by weeks of stalemate were now jumping up with excitement. They had just witnessed something they thought was impossible. Omar Bradley could barely hide his amazement. The famed general looked at the mud-covered tank as if he were seeing the end of a long tunnel. He stepped forward, placed his hand on the steel horns of the Sherman, and spoke words that would be remembered forever. "We've been looking for this solution for 5 weeks, and it turns out it was this simple all along." Those words weren't just about an invention. They marked a turning point. From that moment on, the Rhino Shermans would no longer be experimental. They would be mass-produced. They would lead the charge, and those crude steel horns would become the key to breaking open the gates of France. A deadly bottleneck in Normandy had just been broken, not by a division, nor an air raid, but by the invention of a mechanic who dared to think differently. News spread like wildfire. Right after the successful trial, logistics officers and field engineers were mobilized at full capacity. There was no time for organized mass production. Everything had to be done immediately, on the spot, under fire. Makeshift workshops were hastily set up in newly liberated zones, consisting of little more than tin roofs, a welding bench, a few tank lifts, and plenty of skilled hands from Detroit, New Jersey, Boston soldier mechanics, who had once worked the factory floors across America. Day turned into night. Night rolled into day. The sound of grinding steel, electric welders, and thunderous artillery blended into a single urgent symphony. Culin and his team barely slept, constantly inspecting, measuring, and adjusting each steel horn to fit different Sherman models. Technicians learned how to make the most of the vast steel stockpile left by the Germans in the form of hundreds of Czech hedgehogs scattered along the beaches. The irony was almost too perfect to believe Hitler's steel, now reforged to rip open his own defenses. In less than a week, the first sets of horns were mass-produced, welded onto frames, tested under load, and pushed straight to the front. Forward units received the modified tanks with a mix of curiosity and excitement, as if they had just been handed a secret weapon. When the first Shermans with horns rumbled into view, troops instinctively gave them a name that was both fierce and familiar: Rhino tanks. The nickname caught on instantly. It spread beyond the Bocage, beyond radio chatter. Artillerymen, tank crews, infantry all began calling them rhinos, as if the machines symbolized a whole new confidence. The soldiers were tired of crawling through hedgerows, exhausted from watching their comrades die as stalled tanks became sitting targets. Now, for the first time in weeks, they felt something different. They felt in control. They felt like they could break through. According to logistical reports, within just 10 days, nearly 60% of the Shermans in the 1st U.S. Army had been outfitted with steel horns. It was a rate of deployment almost unthinkable in wartime conditions. Units deeper in the rear even lined up, waiting their turn for the upgrade. The urgency wasn't over bullets or fuel. Everyone simply wanted to be the next to charge through the hedgerows behind a roaring rhino. In battlefield journals, many officers wrote that troop morale had changed visibly overnight. One even joked, "We used to be rats scurrying through a maze. Now, with horns, we're bulls about to smash the gate down." General Eisenhower later remembered the mood just before the assault. "I had never seen the troops so confident. There were no jokes, no bravado, just quiet preparation, with one clear belief: this time, we'll break through." From a battlefield joke to a rough sketch by a mechanic, and finally onto the front lines as a symbol of breakthrough, the Rhino horn was now ready to do what an entire campaign had failed to achieve for over a month: carve a path through the Bocage and break the stalemate in Normandy. At dawn, on the 25th of July 1944, Normandy trembled under the roar of thousands of aircraft engines. A steel storm rained down on German defensive positions around Saint-Lô, the critical junction of the German logistics network in western France. This marked the opening strike of Operation Cobra, the strategic offensive aimed at shattering the 2-month-long deadlock on the Normandy front. Right after the aerial bombardment, American infantry and armor surged forward. For the first time, the assault formation was not led by ordinary Shermans but by Rhino Shermans, tanks outfitted with jagged steel horns jutting out like prehistoric beasts charging into the brush. And for the first time in weeks, the tanks were no longer suffocated by the bocage, no longer scraping helplessly against thick hedgerows. They tore straight through them, with the very horns mounted to their fronts. From afar, the entire battlefield seemed transformed. What was once a tangled maze of foliage had turned into piercing corridors. Dust clouds filled the air, trees toppled to either side, and the bocage crumbled beneath the grinding treads, leaving long, raw furrows like giant plough marks driven deep into enemy lines. The Germans, who had built their entire Normandy defense strategy around the Bocage, were caught completely off guard. Machine gun nests, once hidden behind hedgerows, now lay exposed in open fields. Anti-tank units, once the bane of Shermans, were revealed before they could fire and swiftly obliterated by the Rhino's 75mm cannon. Every link in the German defensive chain collapsed within the first few hours. At Saint-Lô, the 2nd Armoured Division, the birthplace of the first Rhino tanks, led the primary spearhead. Rhino Shermans charged forward, smashing through pockets of resistance and clearing the way for infantry to pour in. Strongholds that had cost hundreds of American lives in a single afternoon now fell in minutes. When German artillery retaliated, US troops no longer crawled under hedges. They advanced, shielded by the rising screen of uprooted bocage, firing rifles, tossing grenades, and sweeping the enemy from their posts. The offensive surged like wildfire. To the west, Avranches fell. The gateway to western France, linking to Brittany and major ports, lay wide open. To the east, British and Canadian forces broke through at Caen, flanking the German position at Falaise. What was once a battlefield chopped into pieces by hedgerows had now become an open plain, and for the first time since D-Day, Allied forces could maneuver freely. The Rhino Shermans rolled day and night without rest. Each one carried hope, and behind them lay the wreckage of shattered German defensive lines. With every hedgerow flattened, another German supply route was severed. Roads that once served as vital arteries now became ambush zones. Wehrmacht convoys carrying fuel, ammunition, and food were intercepted, destroyed, or forced to retreat in chaos. Germany's entire rear logistics network in Normandy was paralyzed piece by piece. Within just 3 weeks of the Rhino's arrival on the front lines, the Nazi supply lines in the western sector collapsed entirely. Frontline divisions were no longer properly resupplied. Tanks ran dry. Infantry ran out of bullets. The German High Command realized too late that the Bocage, once their proud tactical advantage, had become a fatal weakness now that American forces were no longer trapped by it. The climax came at the Falaise pocket in late August. Nearly 50,000 German troops of Army Group B were encircled in a deadly meat grinder, trapped on 3 sides by American, British, Canadian, and Polish offensives. In less than a week, most were captured, the rest cut down during the chaotic retreat. Their escape routes were littered with burnt-out vehicles, abandoned weapons, leaking fuel drums, and spilled rations strewn across the fields. Germany's entire western supply base vanished. Paris was liberated just days later. From there, the US. Armored divisions once bogged down in the Bocage thundered into the French interior, pushing toward the German border within weeks. The victory in Normandy became the most critical strategic launching point on the Western Front, a turning point that tipped the balance of the war in Europe. And at the heart of that lightning advance were the tracks and steel horns of the Rhino Shermans, leading the charge with a weapon so simple no one had thought of it before. Curtis Culin was not a general. He wasn't a strategist. He was just a mechanic, raised among hammers and grease in New Jersey. Yet, on the battlefield of Normandy, he thought of something no one else had, and built something that an entire army had failed to produce for weeks, a path through the Bocage, forged with steel horns, driving straight into the enemy's heart. That very invention turned Curtis Culin from an anonymous soldier into a singular name in the chronicles of World War II. He was awarded the Legion of Merit, and the term Culin cutter quickly became known as one of the most effective tactical innovations on the European front. In newspapers, he was hailed as the embodiment of the American spirit, quiet, steadfast, and inventive. An ordinary man who dared to see a way forward in places the entire army had believed to be dead ends. Top generals held genuine respect for Culin. In his memoir, A Soldier's Story, General Omar Bradley acknowledged the invention as a key factor in the victory at Normandy. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower described Culin's actions as the purest example of Yankee ingenuity, that sharp, practical, relentless spirit of innovation Americans pride themselves on. Just one idea, born in a moment of battlefield stalemate, a hand-drawn sketch, a few steel beams, a team of mechanics, and the entire campaign broke through. That idea saved thousands of soldiers, pushed back tens of thousands of enemies, and gave the Allies the momentum to break free from the Bocage maze, march to Paris, and press deep into German territory. On the commander's maps, those paths, carved by steel horns, were not merely attack routes, they were escape routes, symbols of hope, and proof that victory sometimes begins with the simplest of things. As for Curtis Culin, he never stood atop a podium. He never raised a hand to receive medals under the spotlight. He returned home after the war, leaving part of his body behind in the Hürtgen forest, carrying a story not many had heard. He lived quietly as a salesman, far from stages and speeches, as if he had never changed the course of a battlefield. In 1963, Curtis Culin passed away at the age of 48. But the story never went silent. In the town of Cranford, where he had grown up, a small bronze plaque was erected, engraved with President Eisenhower's words. Sergeant Culin's contribution to the breakthrough victory at Normandy reflects the finest ingenuity of the United States Army. It was not a casual tribute. It was proof that sometimes history is not written by cannon fire, but by the brave idea of someone who saw the right answer before the rest could even name the question.